All right, guys, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to what I think is our last forum for the fall 19 semester. I'm sure you're like me and you're like, where did the semester go? And it's going to be Thanksgiving in a couple weeks, and then Christmas, and then it's a new semester. So at least unless you're graduating, and then you're on to bigger and better things. But for those of you that don't know me, I think I know most everybody in the room, but I'm Eric Money. I'm the Associate Director of Professional Education here in the center. And it's my pleasure to introduce today a couple of our speakers from Esri Charlotte. They've been gracious to come for, as you've probably seen emails, yesterday was GIS Day. This whole week, NC State Libraries has been doing a series of events around GIS, and so we thought it was obviously appropriate to have a forum that was going to be, I think, extremely useful for a lot of us and the things that we do in both research and teaching in our programs here in the center. And so I want to introduce our speakers. We have Harrison Webb and Matthew Dusch. So Harrison graduated from UNC Charlotte in 2017 with a degree in computer science. He started Esri shortly thereafter as an implementation analyst, specializing in configuring ArcGIS Enterprise, and transitioned now into a WebGIS analyst role, combining enterprise implementation with WebGIS, which a lot of you, especially in our master's program, get some good exposure to that. Matthew is an alum from the MGIC program, a fairly recent alum. He graduated in 2016, started Esri in early 2017, and hired initially as an ArcGIS analyst, and then moved on to enterprise analyst position, where he implements and troubleshoots various types of ArcGIS enterprise deployments. And so, as you can tell, there's a lot of WebGIS, ArcGIS, Arc Enterprise, and so that's kind of going to be the focus of the talk today, talking about deploying ArcGIS Enterprise in cloud environments, which I think will be very useful for us in a lot of things that we do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harrison and Matt.
Cool. How's it going, everyone?
Hey, everyone.
So today, kind of like Eric said, we're going to be going over ArcGIS Enterprise. How many people have actually heard of Enterprise or used it before?
I know he has.
Okay, so just a few of you. That's good, because we're gonna tell you what it's all about. If since you've never heard about it, you'll get a good idea of what you can do with it. We'll go over different specifications of each piece of software, because it's kind of like an umbrella with all these different pieces of software underneath it, and each one has its own system requirements. That can add up a lot, so that's why we kind of allowed for cloud-based deployments. And then, speaking of that, we're going to get into different deployment scenarios. We're going to show you a couple examples of some customers that we've worked with. We've made it anonymous, so you don't know who it is, but just kind of show you what you can do with the software. And then we'll get into the actual different cloud deployment options. There's a couple different solutions. AWS and Azure are the two main ones, and that's what we're going to be covering. And it's kind of like driving two different routes to get the same place, but they're pretty much the same, just have different terminologies for each one.
So we'll start off just as a general overview of ArcGIS Enterprise. I know a majority of you who've taken, I think, the 550 course. You start off with an ArcGIS server, single server site, I think with web adapter and like a Postgres database. That's relatively simple compared to what a lot of our customers use nowadays. There's a lot of this portal component, which is very similar to like ArcGIS Online. I don't know if, I think you guys have used it in the WebGIS and part of like 550. It kind of mimics essentially ArcGIS Online, but we'll go more in depth here. So ArcGIS Enterprise as a whole now is kind of a little bit different. There's more pieces to it than it was before. It's all pretty much feeding into Portal for ArcGIS, which acts as that web interface, your map viewers, hosting your content, hosting your items, and sharing those items with your constituents, whether it be your organization or people outside your organization. It's like a publicly available thing with like AWS or Azure. Including is ArcGIS Server, which most of you, the majority are familiar with, and that actually hosts your services. You can publish and edit your services, feed them out to your constituents as well, just as a little bit harder to consume because it uses that REST endpoint rather than like a map viewer with ArcGIS Online or Portal. So adding another component here for the enterprise deployment is the data store. So here's the ArcGIS data store kind of replaces an enterprise geodatabase it removes that dynamic component. So sometimes organizations have these giant SQL databases they've been using for years. Or you just want more customization on that. So you have your own SQL Server, Oracle database, anything like that, that can host the data or store your feature classes or anything like that, and consume that. With Data Store, it's kind of more like a black box. You don't really interface with the Postgres. It's basically, you register it with server and you publish to it. All of your stuff pretty much acts like ArcGIS Online host features. And then the last component, Web Adapter, pretty much just makes your URL look a little bit more pretty, goes over port 443 rather than 6443, and goes over direct host name. So easier for your people to actually type in a URL and find. So for system requirements, there's not too much. It's mostly with RAM. RAM is the biggest bottleneck for ArcGIS, especially with server components. And disk space is relatively easy to get nowadays, so 10 gigabytes is relatively low, but usually people have like 500 to a terabyte easily, so it'd be very cheap to get that. And for ports 7443, 7080, that's just kind of network terminology, allowing ports through that. That's the internal communication essentially. HTTP and HTTPS. Same thing for the data store, 8 gig of RAM, or this is server, excuse me. Portal, server in the center, and then data store on the right. So data store has multiple components to it. It has the relational store, which is the default component of data store. That hosts it's your hosted content, just your feature classes, your feature services, stuff like that. The tile cache is for tile services, your base maps essentially. So tiles it out, easier to consume, uses more hard drive space, but it's easier on your your users to quickly load your data, like you would in any raster data. And once again, disk space is relatively easy to get. But most of these are deployed. I mean, some of these can be deployed on the same machine. So these are kind of additive. You would want a very beefy server, like 32 gigs minimum for like a full stack. That's what we say. Web Adapter, Portal, ArcGIS Server, and Data Store. All those in usage tend to use a lot of resources. So that's one thing to consider if you have everything on one machine. A lot of machines are separated out, so it's less restrictive and easier to manage. So for network diagram, this is just a simple base enterprise deployment that we've seen. From the top, it could be a load balancer. That's just something that helps distribute traffic to multiple machines. It could act like a web server, in this case the Web Adapter, leading to a Web Adapter machine, at least in this case. And I think everything, what's this?
Server machine.
Oh, okay, I didn't see the server there. So portal's on the top one, server on the middle, and then data store on the bottom. Sometimes people have it all on one machine or stacked out, so we can scale up a little easier. Scalability for non-cloud-based solutions is pretty hard since you have to actually upgrade those machines physically. When it comes to cloud solutions, scalability is key, as we can see with this giant enterprise deployment here.
Yeah, so I'll get into this one a little bit. So this was a customer that has obviously a very large production environment. That prod up there is what that means. I don't remember, I was troubleshooting it, I don't remember what the problem was, but essentially to understand what was going on, I had to ask them because they kept showing me all these different machines that we were looking at. I was like, I don't know what we're doing here. And this just shows you how big ArcGIS Enterprise can be. So you can see up here, sorry it's hard to see, it wasn't really easy to put it on one screen, but so this right here is Portal. So there's 3 machines over here. The purple ones just means they're going away in this scenario, but here the green ones are what we're really worried about. So they have a highly available configuration is what we're looking at. So this is specifically for geographic redundancy or primary standby type stuff. So if one goes down, the other one can go back up. And Portal in this scenario is primary standby. It can only ever be primary standby, and that's because of the Postgres databases on the back end. It's just the way that Postgres works. So there's 2 Portal machines, and then this section right here is your ArcGIS server hosting server machines. So there's 2 of them here. Same thing, but this one's actually active-active. They can work together. You don't know which one you're actually accessing whenever you hit its URL. And to back up a little bit, Each one has its own separate machine on this file share where their content's being shared with each other. And then moving on over a little bit more, these are just some regular ArcGIS servers that are federated with our portal. Federation, it's a huge, huge aspect, takes a while to grasp, but basically it means they know about each other, they trust each other, they can communicate with each other. Anything you publish to your server will show up in your portal. Anything you add to your portal will show up in your server, type of thing. But there's 2 of those federated ArcGIS servers. And then moving over a little bit farther, we've got 2 image servers. Very similar to the ArcGIS servers, just for their image services. And raster specifically. And then moving on over, geoanalytics and geoprocessing machines, 2 more machines for that. And each one of these machines, kind of like the previous one showed, I had like terabytes of hard drive space, like 64 gigs of RAM, just so on. And then here's our data store machines. We've got the relational data store down here, which also is a Postgres SQL server, just like Portal runs on. Primary standby. It's the only way it can be configured. Its own set of machines over here. And then our spatio-temporal big data store, which is for geoanalytics and GeoEvent specifically. Its own set of machines. And then GeoEvent, just as I was saying, another version of ArcGIS server, more for like real-time location, things like that. And then ArcGIS Monitor, which kind of monitors this whole deployment here. So say there's a lot of usage going, like for some reason the CPU percentage is spiking on one of the machines, ArcGIS Monitor will be able to monitor that for you, send you an alert, whoever the GIS admin is or whoever's looking at it, they'll be able to know that there's a problem with it, and that'll help you out. But the reason we're showing you this big diagram here is because if you think about that other diagram that Matt was talking about, this is completely different. There's really no limitation to how you can set this stuff up. And there's so many different requirements for every ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. This was a huge company. The one that Matt showed you was more of like a mom and pop shop that just needed portal server and data store just on 3 little machines. And that's what they needed. And what we're going to tie this into is how you can do this with cloud-based solutions, specifically AWS, Amazon Web Services, and Azure, which is by Microsoft. And we do have a couple out-of-the-box solutions that allow for that. And so this leads us to ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud. AWS and Azure. So they're both, kind of like how I said earlier, they're both just 2 different routes to get to the exact same thing. I personally am a fan of AWS more. It's just kind of the first one I used. It's readily available. We're going to get into some of the things you can do with it. There's a couple different solutions like CloudFormation, CloudBuilder. You can use the command line to deploy it. You can use Python to deploy it. Chef scripts to deploy it. You got to have an Amazon subscription, an AWS subscription. I'm not really too sure how you get that. I was just given it once I got the job at Esri. They were just like, here you go, play with it. So I'm not sure if you guys have that capability or who you have to reach out to do for that. But you'll have to make sure that you have an AWS or an Azure subscription. And it's going to have specific requirements, specifically like EC2 access, and then like S3 bucket access, things like that. Azure is probably a little bit easier. I think it's kind of like an all-in-one account. So like whoever the administrator of that Azure organization would be kind of says, okay, well, this person has access to create virtual machines, this person doesn't, and it's pretty much simple as that. So moving on. So here's AWS's agenda. So we're going to talk about the AWS Management Console. This is exactly how it sounds. It's a web, I guess a website that you go to where you can see any sort of AWS-based resource that you've got out there. You can manage it. You see all sorts of information based off of it. You can upload your certificates for easy access if you need to put it on another machine, things like that. We're going to talk about AMIs, which is just an Amazon machine image. It's like the virtual machine, like a fancy word for a virtual machine. There's different types of them. We're going to go over those. We're going to talk about CloudFormation, which is my favorite. It's pretty easy, step by step. Each one, like each specific section that you got to fill out, send you to a doc if you don't know what it is. You can just do a lot of reading. There's a lot of reading in all of this.
There's a lot of documentation.
Yeah, it's like an encyclopedia. It's ridiculous. CloudBuilder command line interface. We're going to briefly touch on this. You got to have, you don't have to have it, but most of the IT folk out there in the GIS world are the ones using this one, because it's more for like automation and things like that. You can kind of copycat environments, send them to over here, send them to over there, things like that. And then the S3 bucket, which is a big requirement specifically for CloudFormation. And it also makes your life easier when you're using AWS. So AWS Management Console. So this is a literal website. It's called like aws.management.console.com or something like that. We'll show you what it looks like. But it's where you look at your EC2 instances. Like I said, that's a specific Amazon name for their virtual machines. It's where you'll create your elastic load balancers, which is 100% required if you're going to deploy Portal for ArcGIS specifically. And the reason for that is Portal, if you turn off the machine and it's in a cloud environment, then you turn it back on, it could be in another server across the country or something like that. You don't know where it's going to go. And what this elastic IP address does is it gives that specific instance where that portal is installed at, it gives it its own IP address that will never change. So whatever you've given that elastic IP address is now recognized by Portal. You restart the machine, be good to go. You never have to worry about it. The first time I ever did this, I did not know you had to have elastic load balancer. I was working with a customer. I had to try and reproduce the problem, and I didn't give an elastic load balancer or elastic IP address, and it didn't work. I had to do it again. And then it's got your security groups. Your security groups, think of that as like a firewall in a way. You'll have to, those ports that Matt was talking about on the system requirements, you have to go into the security group. You have to say, hey, 7443 is allowed for this machine or this person, my IP address, whoever you want it to be for. You can open it to the entire world so anyone can access if you wanted to. So there's all sorts of different port numbers that you'll have to put into there. If you want to actually remote into the machine, RDP access, remote desktop connection, you'll have to give it the 3389 port in there, allow it to like your personal machine or your lab computer, whatever you're doing this on. Otherwise, you won't be able to actually get into that specific EC2 instance, which will cause a lot of headaches if you don't know what you're doing and you have to get on the machine.
You can think of security groups kind of like group policy. You can apply all your ports there, set it to specific users, groups of users, makes it easier to manage your people like that if you have multiple instances of AWS out there. And also, I think the AMIs, they come with all these security groups on the website.
Yeah. So we'll get into that a little bit on the next slide, I believe. So here you can also, we'll get into what the S3 bucket is a little bit, but this allows you to create an S3 bucket. Think of the S3 bucket as like cloud storage. It's literally stored in whatever your AWS's organization account is. You can manage, like I can see if Matt has one, you can see mine. I could put stuff in Matt's S3 bucket if I really wanted to, but you can lock them down so other people don't do that. But it's essentially your own personal cloud-based storage. Think of it as like Google Drive or something like that if you're familiar with it, or OneDrive. And then you can actually create Amazon-based certificates. The certificates get a little tricky.
I don't know if we touch certificates or not.
Say that again?
Do we install certificates for the ArcGIS servers here? Or do you have
Okay, so you guys have like an internal certificate authority here, or you have to go to like GoDaddy or anything?
We use hey, I'm Bill Slogan.
Oh, hey, Bill.
Hey, we use InCommon,
Okay.
and it used to be per machine deployment for each certificate, but for our MGIST folks, we have a sub-domain, so we can use a wildcard now.
Perfect. Wildcard makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to get into just different types of certificates, but if you guys have your own, that's perfect.
Yeah, it makes it so much easier.
Otherwise, you could use GoDaddy or DigiCert, or if NC State had a different internal CA authority, you do that. AWS has its own certificate authority that you can use. That costs money, obviously, just like any of those other certificate authorities. But if you wanted to go that route, you could do it. There's also a certificate manager, which I'll show you here in a second, where you can put that wildcard certificate. If you guys have like a parent AWS organization, kind of like how Esri Support Services does, we've got our wildcard certificate actually in there. So if you lose your wildcard certificate in your file structure somewhere and no idea where it's at, you feel bad, you don't want to reach out to someone because they ask you why'd you lose it. Well, it's actually, you can store it in there and download it yourself and you've got it. So it's a good safe spot to keep that. And so this is what the AWS Management Console looks like. I've got it on Google Chrome right now. So this is AWS right here. So this is the one we're going to be looking at. We're not going to actually look at the portal and server that just yet, but this is my specific instance right here. You can see I've deployed another one up here called HWeb DS Primary. It's for a data store test, but there's all sorts of stuff you can do right here. And this is all the stuff specific to my instance called HWeb Demo Cloud. And I've got my Elastic IP address, so that's the address that will not change if I reboot the machine. And I know that because I've already tried it a few times and it still works. This is the public DNS record for it. Its IP address. Yet there's a private DNS for it, private IP address. Here's my security group right here. Show you what that looks like. Those are all my ports right there that I was talking about. There's portal and servers ports. There's the 3389, so we could remote into that machine right now if we wanted to. You have to have my specific key pair, and the key pair is essentially, think about it as like literally a key. It's an access key to that specific machine. You can create new ones if you want, but whenever you actually create this instance, this EC2 instance, it's going to ask you what key pair do you want to use. So if you lose that key, you'll never be able to get back into that specific instance. You'll have to start over. And you want that key pair because every time you remote into the machine, the password will change. So you definitely want to keep that in safekeeping. But there's all sorts of stuff on here that we could have a whole nother forum just about specific AWS requirements and terminologies and things like that. But there's all sorts of things. So like I'm on the subnet. C. Paul Izin is one of my coworkers who knew what he was doing and set up his own subnet in AWS. Anything else you think we can talk about on this?
Network I/O.
So here we go. We'll get into geographic redundancy in a little bit with CloudFormation. But this, if I wanted to use a specific tool to create an exact copy of this HWeb demo cloud, I could. I've got mine right now in Northern Virginia. That's the one they want me to use. It's closest to our office. Our West Coast, our Redlands office uses the Northern California one. If I click that, you can see all their stuff. But I could have one in Northern Virginia, and I could have one in Oregon or Northern California. Something happens in Northern Virginia, catches on fire, quickly switches over to the Northern California one.
So it's something to consider is network I/O for performance of your server. So if you're going a long distance, it's going to take longer to actually reach your services, reach your data. So you always want everything in the same region or the closest region to your actual location as possible or to whoever you're serving it out to. I mean, not only network I/O, but communication between different machines, if there's any different domains, subnets, stuff like that. Just something to be aware of. Also, your Azure or your in any of your databases specifically should always be in the same location because that's another set of I/O for database in out essentially, how fast it takes to read or write files. But yeah.
So here, AMI. Esri AMIs, so Amazon Machine Image. So there's AMIs out there with a base Ubuntu image if you wanted. There's AMIs out there for Red Hat images. There's AMIs out there for Windows with just a straight up Windows server or a Windows 10 machine or whatever you want it to be. Esri has customized, work with Amazon to create its own AMIs that you can go out there and search for. It's got ArcGIS Enterprise 10.7 on Windows 2016. You can easily deploy an enterprise system by clicking a few buttons. You just have to have the AWS credentials and the requirements, things like that. It's super, super simple. You can do a base enterprise deployment, just like Matt showed you, but it would all be on the same machine. It would portal server, data store, web adapter, all on the same machine. You could do a standalone GIS server just on its own. You could do a highly available deployment if you wanted to. So just kind of I was saying, the primary standby portal and server. It's really kind of endless what you want to do. You could deploy your own SQL Server out there to work in conjunction with your enterprise system that you deployed. And here's the website for that too. Yeah, we're gonna have to. I'll just go over here.
Just go to the AMIs.
launch instance. So you can see my MI, the AWS Marketplace, blah, blah, blah. There's all sorts of stuff on here you can use. We're just going to search here, Esri. AWS Marketplace. So these are by Esri, you can see. So if you wanted to right now, you could do ArcGIS Enterprise 10.6.1, Windows 2019. It looks like 2016. With SQL Server Express on it, so that's good to know. 10.7. We can do 10.5 with SQL Server Express. Here's an Ubuntu with 10.6.1. I've got one of those on there I can show you if you'd like in a little bit. Ubuntu with Postgres on it. There's all sorts of different ones on here that you can use. It just kind of depends, yeah. And like I said, you can deploy your own AMI and then send the software EXEs to it and install and configure it yourself if you wanted to. It just whatever you're required to do.
These pretty much have everything built in, ready to go, like ready to configure on your own for many different scenarios. So it's a nice all-in-one kind of resource.
Yeah, very limited required knowledge to deploy one of those. CloudFormation. So this is what I was talking about. It's kind of like my favorite little tool. There's a website for this as well that will show you that you can use. So you can use it for a single machine deployment. The one that we're going to just show you what it looks like today is just a single machine deployment. It's got portal, server, data store, and the web adapter on the same machine. It might have SQL Server. I'm not sure. Can't remember. There's a button to do highly available, and it's going to do the exact same thing I was just talking about with primary standby. The disaster recovery environment, there's a button for that. And you can do this on Windows. You can do it on Ubuntu. You can choose which geographic region you want to do it in. So like I said, if you wanted to have one in Northern Virginia, you wanted to have one in California, you'd be just fine to do that. And a good example of this is recently I was working with, I was going about my day, just taking support calls, and I got a message from my boss. He was like, hey, can you work with this production down issue in Puerto Rico? So I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And they're still experiencing a lot of infrastructure issues, specifically with like their power grid and things like that. So I got on the phone call, the customer I was working with, he said, hey, sorry if I get disconnected with you. We have power flickers every couple hours or something like that. And it happened on the phone. Not only did we lose the phone call, the environment, so they had a highly available environment, but it was on their own infrastructure in wherever in Puerto Rico they were at. And so the entire thing was down. And there's only a few utilities companies that in Puerto Rico, and this was one of them. And so pretty, I guess, popular maps out there, if you will. And so it was always down, pretty much, until we worked on it. But a good scenario for them would maybe work with whoever's deploying this stuff for them, and maybe their own infrastructure is not the right solution for them. Maybe they need to use CloudFormation and have servers in the United States somewhere or wherever. You can see there's some in Asia, there's some in Europe, all over the place. But that's a great example of why geographic redundancy for a high-profile enterprise environment is needed. Because if one goes down, you quickly have a backup right there, the exact same instance, essentially, just different server room. And then this is what the CloudFormation templates look like. So you can see you can do it all the way from 10.3.1, 10.4, all the way to 10.7.1. We're on the 10.7.1 page right now. And you can see there's all sorts of different hyperlinks right here. You can click on with different documentation, things like that. So if you scroll down just a little bit, keep going. Right here specifically, just a little bit more. Right there. So you can see there's a single machine deployment, and you can, if you don't know what you're doing, click on this little README right here. It's going to take you to another AWS documentation, and then that documentation is going to take you to Esri documentation, all sorts of stuff like that. You can do it on Ubuntu, Windows. Here's our disaster recovery environment in a different region. It's pretty self-explanatory there. I'm not sure why it doesn't have the launch stack at 10.7.1. That's new to me. That's not good. But anyways, there's all sorts of different things you can do. So keep scrolling. You got ArcGIS server standalone. You could do a geo event server if you wanted to do any sort of real-time analytics. A standalone ArcGIS server sites. This will talk to you about, I'm not well-versed in Python myself, but you can use these templates. you can actually download these templates. We'll show you the demo. We've already pre-recorded it, so there's no technical difficulties or anything like that. But you can download these little these templates that it's going through, which is essentially just a JSON file with different specifics for where you're deploying it, how you're deploying it, the names of these things, and things like that. But you can use Python or you can use Chef to automate this stuff. So that's pretty cool. You can even send one out to upgrade the environment. And then the AWS CloudBuilder CLI. This is essentially using those JSON files that you can download there. But it's through the Windows command prompt. You have to download a couple of things to make it actually work. But you can manipulate this JSON file. Say you want portal, server, data store, web adapter on 4 machines separately in the Northern Virginia region, and you could just basically you have to change the name of the machines, and you could just deploy it as many times as you wanted to, as long as your AWS subscription allowed you to deploy that many machines. But it's super quick and easy to do once you have those files created. And then the AWS S3 bucket. Like I said, it's a cloud-based storage solution. You can use, you can store your, you can actually publish to this thing. You can have your ArcGIS server send its content directory to the S3 bucket. Tile cache, things like that. You can just use it as just like a drive, like a Google Drive if you wanted to. But this is required for the CloudFormation. So in the CloudFormation, which we'll show you, you store your certificates there. So it'll have a little field where you point to the certificates or you point to the licenses for portal and server, and you have to have that or CloudFormation will never work. And then here's the little demo. So we're just gonna do a 10.6.1 one. Click it one more time. There you go. So it took me 4 minutes to do this. I mean, I've done it before, so that's why. So I'm just going to do the single machine deployment here. Launch stack. Template's ready. Everything's good to go. Nothing I need to do there. You could view what the AWS specifics looks like in the little designer. So this is the name of it. I'm going to call it HWeb Demo Cloud, which is what you guys saw on the Management Console. VPC ID, which you'll have to have created for you. This is your virtual private cloud. It's just like your network that this is going to sit on in AWS. The subnet for that, like I said, this is C. Paulizin. He had already created that for me. This is going to be the name that you're going to access it in the web browser, Google Chrome or whatever it is. Demo Cloud. It's going to be democloud.support.geocloud.com is what my domain is. This is the Elastic IP I'm talking about. So you have to go into, you can see on the Management Console, it's there. Give its little name there, and it knows where to deploy that at. This is the type of machine, so it's going to be M4X large, so it's like a 4-core machine with 16 gigs of RAM or something like that. Not a big machine at all. This is going to be the C drive where my operating system's installed. 200 gigs is fine for what I was doing. And then my data drive where I'm actually going to be having my content directories at. 800 gigs, just fine. This is the key pair. This is the key that it's going to be using when you want to remote into the machine. You can see I've got a whole bunch of them that I lost. I've got HWeb Ubuntu. This is one I use for my Ubuntu machines. But you can reuse it if you still have it. This is the deployment bucket. So the name of my S3 bucket is called HWeb bucket. You cannot have capital letters in there. You'll figure that out. This is the name of my file for my license file for ArcGIS server that's in there. Portal license.
So this is 10.6.1, so it's still using the PRVC.
Right. Yeah, you'll use a JSON file for portals license at 10.7 and beyond.
Hey guys, so while that's running through, you talked about the license.
Yep.
When you deploy this, or does it automatically create a provisioning file, or do we have to bring our own?
You'll have to get your own provisioning file. Yep. And store that in the S3 bucket. And then this is my site admin, so I'm going to be logging into Portal with site admin, and then its credentials there, that's the password. This is my SSL certificate, so my file is called wildcard_support_geocloud_.com or _com. PFX, which is the full certificate chain. This is the password to access that certificate chain that I've saved to it. And then it's just a script I could download if I wanted to use it. No need for that. These are all different sorts of, I'm going to give it like a tag. I think it's going to be HWeb or something like that. It's just a specific tag for it. You don't have to put anything in there if you don't want to. This is, don't have much information on these. The guy that manages AWS doesn't give us training on that, so sorry about that. But after that, it's pretty much done. I'm going to hit next down here. Oh, this rollback on configuration. You can set that to disable. So if you do that and it fails, it won't actually delete everything. You can actually kind of troubleshoot why it failed. It'll give you all these different errors and things like that. I recommend keeping it on disabled. My boss messaged me, wanted me to own a case with a customer during this. Sorry about that. And then I acknowledge and create stack, and that's it. So it's going to create in progress. It's going to eventually, I'm not going to show you that because it takes, I think it took like 30 minutes or something, pretty quick. But it'll say like create complete or something like that. Something pretty easy, something easy to see. But you can see down there the red text, rollback complete. For some reason, whoever was doing this, it failed. And we could go into that and see different errors, things like that. Maybe they didn't have the permissions to their S3 bucket or something like that. I'm not sure. But it's pretty simple there.
So that was 4 minutes for Portal, ArcGIS Server, Data Store, Web Server, and already licensed, ready to configure. Already have the site admin already ready for Portal and Server. Like, it does a lot of work for you that you have to essentially just sit at a computer or wait for things to install on your own. So automation is key when it comes to cloud resources like this.
All right, and this is it right here.
Yep.
democloud.support.geocloud.com. You can see it's got my valid certificate. There it is. That's my wildcard with a DigiCert certificate. So if you've never seen this before, it looks like, yeah, it's going.
The demo you just showed us,
Mm-hmm.
is there any documentation or video available?
Yeah. There's all sorts of stuff out there. We can.
We can provide a bunch of documentation.
Yeah, we'll provide you some documentation. So I got my business card over there too. So feel free to grab one of those, and we'll send you all sorts. We can send you the presentation, send you documentation, anything really to help you out. We're more than happy to.
I have a question about how to determine the system requirements, like how many cores and how many routes and those type of things. Are you going to be experimenter or?
It really varies.
Yeah, it varies.
Like-
That's the thing.
Yeah.
If we have a portal and ArcGIS server and then data store, what does it mean normally commit for that?
Oh, I mean, for this, it would just be additive right here. So 8, 8, and 9, and if you're going tile, add additional 8. I mean, this space is just going to be easy to get, so a minimum of like 100 or 200.
But if you're going to be doing all sorts of geoprocessing like that, that minimum requirements aren't going to cut it. It just kind of, it's really hard to say. I get these questions every single day.
Yeah, I cannot find any documentation for
Yeah. So there's actually another piece of documentation on professional services, who's essentially consultants. They've got these equations out there that they kind of, that's how they, when a customer, whenever a customer wants specifics from, say I'm on the call and they want specifics, well, I'm going to send them over to our professional services team who uses these equations, and which is public facing. We can send that to you as well.
The GIS wiki has it.
Yeah, it's a GIS wiki essentially, and it kind of just depends on what you're going to be doing. But you can go through that, and it'll be a great help for you.
Yeah. You would need to know like how many people are using your services, what exactly they're doing, because it could be geoprocessing or it could just be visiting your services. So those are going to be lots of different variables.
So if trying to use GeoAnalytics server, then
Yeah, that's going to be a big one too. It's,
Yeah.
you need multiple nodes for the data store plus the geoanalytics, so that could be like 3 machines right there. Minimum would be 8 to 16 each.
still configurable. Is it okay to deploy in a single machine?
I wouldn't put
Not for
GeoLinux
GA.
on a single
Definitely
machine.
not for GA.
No, definitely not. Oh, we were back at the, we're just showing the, yeah. So let me just log in. So if you've never seen Portal before,
Very similar to ArcGIS Online. I mean, they upgraded. This is what, 10.7.1 or 10.6.1?
this is 10.6.1.
Okay, 10.6.1 is probably about a year ago, like AGL look, before they upgraded recently.
When you
Yeah.
federate the portal now, it used to be you could only have one federated server at a time.
You have
You
all
got
sorts of
Have
them.
they changed that yet?
Yeah. You would have a hosting server and then multiple ArcGIS server sites with it.
Yeah.
all using the portal credentials.
Federate one server.
Yeah, yeah. It's been a long time since 10.3.1. That was super restrictive, like very early portal stuff.
Looks like 10.5 too.
Yeah, yeah. They really haven't added much. I think 10.5 was like 10.5.1. Right after that, they added so much because it's pretty much getting parallel in line with ArcGIS Online, which they're constantly updating. So I mean, we have 1 or 2 major releases, a 0.1 release twice per year.
Yeah.
So it's going to be behind ArcGIS Online, but you're going to be able to host it all internally,
Right. Yeah, and you can see here, this is our content page. This is
just like ArcGIS Online.
just like ArcGIS Online. These bottom like 7 things right here are just default stuff that come from ArcGIS Server that it's federated with. We added this file geodatabase here, and then we published it as a feature layer. So this is going to have, just like ArcGIS Online, except for you're going to be hosting it. So there's a reference in it in Portal. ArcGIS Server's got a reference to it. And then it's also, all that data is stored in the Postgres for the ArcGIS data store, relational data store specifically. And then we just created a simple little web map here just so you can see the data that we have in
Please
there.
excuse my cartography.
There's just some sample data we use
Yeah.
in support if we need to do some quick tests. Yeah, so it's pretty cool.
Also of note, we're using ArcGIS Online base maps here, so you can use your own internal base maps, host it all, but this would be going outside of your network, say if you're concerned about security, stuff like that. Some, like the larger companies, they like to keep everything internally, or they host their own base map server, stuff like that. Things are much more secure when you can keep it all internally. And some clientele don't like to have that stuff externally available. That's pretty much it for just general usage. There's a lot more that Portal can do, but this is just a general overview here.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I could see it potentially being confusing, having it look exactly like ArcGIS Online, when students are used to, like, right now we have students, they'll deliver web services into a web app they build in ArcGIS Online,
Yeah.
right, with REST endpoints. In this case, is it the case where now they could just do all of that in Portal?
Yeah.
They can build web apps and everything
Yep.
within
REST
Portal and never
services.
have to touch ArcGIS Online?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Okay.
So you can publish hosted feature service to ArcGIS Server,
Yeah.
then you can hit the REST services and have that same folder structure accessible by, controlled users, so same groups or individual.
So in the case of that, your contents list where it was saying geoprocessing service, hosted feature layer, basically that's saying this is hosted on my EC2.
Yeah, the data store in this instance.
Okay,
Yeah.
Yep.
Or
So
you could have just normal feature services like you would in just a standalone site from connected to a normal Postgres or a SQL Server, Oracle, stuff like that.
yep. And so this is the stuff at the REST endpoint for the federated server that we have, that we just showed that web map for.
Yeah, you would add it to a web map and then consume that in a web application just with this reference here.
And just a quick little troubleshooting tip: if once you get these things up and running, say you can't add a service to Portal, or that says like unable to add layer to map in Portal's web map or something like that. Quick little spot. Portal, it's a cool little application that looks like ArcGIS Online on the front end, but it's got this back end over here called the admin endpoint. You just log into that with those credentials that you gave it in the CloudFormation demo. You go there, federation. Remember that keyword federation. It's the handshake between your ArcGIS server and your Portal for ArcGIS. So that's the key. So you go click on Federation, Servers. You can see this is my hosting server right here. It's an EC2 instance. It's got all the information. You have to actually, once you're doing this, if you do this manually, you'll have to enter in this stuff once you federate. I'm not going to show you how to do that, but there's some good docs we can send you on that. But go validate it. If it says unable to add a map, easiest thing to troubleshoot is just go to this endpoint, click validate. It's going to take a minute or so, so just be patient with it. But if it fails, it's going to give you a reason as to why it failed. Maybe it says can't access the ArcGIS server or something like that. Data store's down. It's something. It's going to give you a good little error, and then you can go kind of do any sort of troubleshooting if it happens. But this is a success, so it gives you all this cool little message. Probably doesn't mean anything to you. But this is a very good thing to see if you click validation. But that's just a little troubleshooting tip.
So Azure, very, very similar. it's a parallel pathway to AWS. You have that CloudBuilder. You have the ability to deploy high availability machines, get that redundancy going. Azure Blob is
Azure Blob is the S3 bucket for Azure.
okay. And then the management applications, the portal, azure.com. It's a very similar interface, just is Microsoft's version of the AWS console.
That's right.
And then CloudBuilder, just like AWS, you have a GUI-based application for deploying these small, big, any large size. It's just like AWS, where you have these images that you can use, predetermined builds, stuff like that. It's customizable. You have the high availability as well. And just like before, it's scalable, just like AWS. So you have a small to large, whatever your constituents need, you can deploy that if needed. And this is just the Azure Portal. Essentially, you're just finding or managing your deployments there. And you can also deploy your load balancer for Azure, which is essentially, like we said before, if you have a high availability deployment, you'll need that load balancer to direct traffic to the primary, the secondary. And also we have the SQL database. I think that's an Azure SQL specific.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually a SQL server.
Yeah, it's its own
it acts the
proprietary.
same way, but
Yeah. And those would be hosted in their own, I think, instance. So you would have to worry about that I/O, as I mentioned before. So this is the CloudBuilder. It's a very simple GUI. You go through your templates, you name it, just like you would in AWS. This is gonna
yeah, it should hover over it. There it goes. And then this is unfortunately, this we can't access. I don't know what's wrong with it. I broke it, I guess,
You broke it
yesterday. Yeah, it's for a bug, for an issue. But this is a highly available deployment that will be that I have, and I'll show you the.
machines.
Yeah, there's 9 machines in there. 2 portal machines, 2 servers, 2 web adapters, 2 data stores, and then a file share.
Yeah, you can think of it as like branching off 2 parallel deployments.
But this is even quicker than the CloudFormation. So this is, remember, the blob is not actually required. This is just me grabbing my license files from our file share that's out in our Redlands office. We got all sorts of licenses out there. And so server license is going to go to the same spot. My certificate is also locally on my machine. So don't think you have to have the Azure blob for Azure to use the CloudBuilder. So this is my site admin account. So I'm going to log into Portal with these credentials here. Portal admin with its password. ArcGIS service account. Each one of these pieces of software runs with its own Windows service. So this is that account. You're specifying that right now. So the name of it's ArcGIS with its passwords. As a quick tip, the password I always use is like machine admin, capital M, capital A, 1, 2, 3, exclamation point, because there's so many weird requirements that Azure has for its
like
users.
Base Windows security
Yeah,
policy.
and I did the same thing for this the machine administrator, so it's going to create 2 Windows accounts for it.
What's your username again?
Yeah, this machine doesn't exist anymore, so don't worry about it. And this is the data disk for it. All sorts of different stuff here. Each one of these costs a different amount of money, same as AWS. So the more services you have published, the more money you're going to be spending. So always think about that.
And then you can just choose external available or
Yep.
external hard drive.
So it's a 4-core machine with 14 gigs of RAM, 500 gig disk.
Access RDP over 3389.
Yep. Be sure to click that button, and you'll never be able to get into the actual virtual machine. Not gonna. I think I am gonna do tile cache for this, so I can have any sort of scene services or anything like that published. This is the storage account, so this is the deployment region where it's gonna see its file share, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's
Once
the
again,
SSL certificate, the name of it, my domain name, Harrison Stack, path to the file. Like I said, this one's local on my machine here. And then its password.
Password 123.
Yeah. And so this page right here, this button, you can save the summary, so you can see all sorts of, if you ever forget any sort of information that you've done with this, then hope you save this summary, because it'll give you some good information about that. Maybe you don't remember the name of the machine administrator or something like that. It'll at least tell you that. It won't give you the password. You can save this automation artifact You can use that artifact to use Chef or Python or anything like that to also automate this as well. If that's your route, then definitely save that automation artifact. You can spin up another environment very similar to the one you just did. But that's it for the Azure demo, and I'll show you the Azure portal.
Is that a ceiling?
It's not going to work. So this is the Azure portal. So this is the home.
Very similar to AWS.
Very similar. It's
different GUI.
all sorts of different stuff, though. They're called virtual machines on Microsoft's Azure, which I like better. Just AWS just tried to get fancy, I guess, and create their own term. So here you go. You'll see HWeb data store primary, standby, the file share where all the content's at, portal primary, portal secondary or standby, HWeb server 1, HWeb web, which is the web adapter, and the HWeb web 1, which is the other web adapter machine. So you can click on one of these things, and just like AWS, you got all sorts of different stuff that you'll probably never touch. So it's not that big of a deal to know. Yeah. But yeah, so you can see there's like a public IP address for it. Paul Lizen created the same thing for this one, so thank you, Chris. I didn't have to worry about doing that myself. You can see the operating system it's on, which you can, news to me as yesterday, you can deploy Linux or Unix-based operating systems in Azure. I didn't know you could do that.
Windows allowed it.
Windows allowed it, which is cool. So I might start messing around with that soon. You can see usage of the machine itself. So you see this big spike right here. That was earlier today.
I was just trying to access it.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to access it. It's down. I don't know what's wrong with it. I'm getting a 502. Not sure. I think the load balancer machine, which is also my file share machine, something's wrong with it. It was doing the same thing yesterday. I don't know. The REST endpoint was working. Yeah, see, that works. I don't know. I broke it somehow.
Story of our life, I guess.
Yeah. A lot of our deployments in Esri go through a lot of destructive testing. But yeah, so like I said, it's 2 different routes to get to the exact same place. I've got two different enterprise systems. These are public facing. You could access it on your cell phone right now if you wanted to. Don't do that though.
Please don't.
I'll turn them off later. But yeah, so that's it. That's it for ArcGIS Enterprise in the cloud. And I'm sure there's questions, so feel free to ask them.
The notebook server, is it possible to deploy on the AWS?
The ArcGIS server?
Notebook server.
Oh, notebook? Yeah, I don't know if the AMIs are there for, but I know you can.
Yeah, there's not going to be an AMI out there for it, but you'll have to get, wherever you get your the software EXEs or executables from, you'll just have to bring it over there manually. And you can do that with the S3 bucket.
Okay.
So
different configuration, it's not included in the builder, I mean.
No.
No.
It's not a part of the base enterprise. The base enterprise would be more with the GUI elements.
right. And I don't have, I wish S3 browser was installed on this machine. I'll show you where you can get it at. So the S3 browser is a GUI little application for adding stuff and taking stuff from the S3 bucket.
Kind of like an FTP.
Just
program.
Google S3 browser, and you'll download it from there. And you'll log into it with your Amazon credentials, things like that, and you'll see the actual the files in there. It looks just like, if you've ever used like FileZilla or WinSCP or anything like that, it's just a little application that shows you files in a directory. But yeah, so be sure if you're gonna be doing AWS, then 100% you want this S3 browser, which is just a little application for S3 buckets.
So I have a question about like Esri licenses in the cloud. So let's just say I've set up something on AWS, I've got my database on there and everything, and I've set up some geoprocessing service that run on the database. But let's say I want to run it 500 times, and I know with EC2 and SQS you're able to do things simultaneously. Can I use that one Esri license like multiple times in parallel, or do I need separate licenses?
It really just depends on the license you got.
Okay.
Like there's, There's definitely a couple of times you can authorize each license, but I think once you start getting too many of them, like if you try to authorize it the same one on like 10 machines, it's probably not going to work.
I get a call from your account manager.
Yeah, the NC State Esri account manager will probably try and talk to you.
You're going to have, you'll be successful with a provisioning file for server from the university, but not an enterprise provisioning file. We only have a few of those, simply because of licensing at the university level. Yeah, this, if y'all don't know, you don't know. With what you just demonstrated in the CloudBuilder and the chef scripts, the AMIs and all that kind of stuff, that's in one version of AWS. We're looking at using AWS Educate, which is a different bucket. Last year, Esri didn't have all of those different templates and formations ready for AWS Educate. Do y'all think y'all are going to go that direction?
I have no idea. I could easily ask someone though.
Yeah. I've asked a few folks at the Dev Summit, but
I mean, I would assume you can use any of the, like this, maybe the CLI, Chef, there's...
they still have them available in the
Yeah.
AWS Educate realm.
You're just talking about like the AMIs, like the Esri AMIs that are readily, like we showed you. So yeah, I mean, I had no idea. I've never heard of AWS Educate, but it shouldn't be that hard to transition one over there.
It's something that we're looking at, our IT group
Okay.
are looking at to deploy
Yeah.
instead of using our NC State hosted cloud.
Sure, yeah. We've got a position above, like me and Matt, called a tech lead. They're kind of like the like subject matter experts in specific versions of enterprise or desktop or something like that.
Liaisons to dev also.
Yeah, kind of like the liaisons to our development team. And one of the guys specializes in cloud, so I'll be sure to reach out to him.
Feel free
for
to
sure.
ping us or email us with that, and then we'll get back to you on it. Anyone else?
Yeah. So you should having, a separate machine for web adapter, separate machine for data store, separate machine for portal, right?
For the base
Is that
enterprise.
generally best practice, or is there some kind of threshold when it's okay to just put all of it on one machine versus keeping everything on separate machines?
Right. So, an example of having everything on the same machine would be like our definitely a non-production environment. Like if you plan on doing stuff that you're going to need to access, you're going to need some quick speed, I would highly recommend putting portal server, data store, and web adapters. Web adapter doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It's literally just a tunnel from ugly URL to a pretty
It's just
URL.
built on IIS.
Yeah. So that doesn't matter, but I would definitely recommend portal server and data store on separate machines. It makes sense. That's a lot of RAM and usage and things like that. I mean, each one of those ArcSocs for ArcGIS server can use up like 500 megabytes of RAM just alone.
Definitely don't want SQL or Postgres on the same machine as well, because those are really, really heavy RAM hogs. So I think SQL by default uses all available RAM. So I've seen it use like 3 gigs of RAM when no one is doing any kind of SQL transaction. So it really depends on, I mean, we're going to say this a lot, it really depends on who's using it. But web server is not going to be using a lot of resources. It's going to be mostly portal server data store. So you definitely want those on separate machines, best practice.
And a good example of it all on the same machine is like our desktops that we use at our desks every day. I think mine is 32 gigs of RAM.
16. So
Yours is
I can't
16,
even run portal
yeah.
with 16.
Yeah, and so I think we've got a 500 gigabyte C drive with operating systems at, and then like a terabyte D drive where like all my downloads and data and everything else is at. And it's usually if I have portal server and data store installed on my machine, and I've got like 5 or 6 services published to it, and data store is doing its thing, portal's doing its thing, might have a colleague saying, hey, does anyone have a 10.7 portal I can publish to? And I might have that 10.7 portal. Then I could have someone accessing it. And so just without me doing anything on my
One or two
PC,
people less.
yeah, like 1 or 2 people accessing it without me doing anything on my PC. It might have Chrome up or something. Typically, I'm going to have like 50% RAM usage at least, and then my CPU percentage is going to be up from like 30 to 50%, just depending on what's going on. And that's, if someone's actually publishing to it, probably going to go up for both of those for sure. And that's just on my local desktop where I've got all that installed. So it just kind of depends. I've since not put them all on the same machine for my testing environments. I've got them out here in Azure. We've also got our own internal cloud that we can use as well, but it's not as good as Azure and
Similar to what you
AWS.
guys are using now.
Yeah, similar to that. I mean, that's hosted in our Redlands office, so it's not as quick
We
for
have
us.
an IO problem that you guys would.
So just a question about the Python interfaces. So I saw 2.7 on one of the slides. Are they still in 2.7?
Two-
3 and 2.7 Alpha
Yeah, so
server?
2.7 is for ArcGIS Server, and I think Portal uses 3.2.
Yeah, so Notebook Server is going to be using 3 with the Python API with Jupyter Notebook, but 2.7 is still in use with like ArcMap and Server.
All right, well, let's, Jeff, did you have any?
Go ahead, Aaron.
One more, yeah, just one.
For those of you that want to do this, Dustin and I have found an issue with working in a virtualized environment. Virtualized RAM doesn't work as the same RAM as you have on your desktop, right? And it can distribute those resources in a virtual environment differently. So even though you can run this software on less than that 8 gig that they're showing you, if you don't have 8 gigabytes dedicated in your virtualized environment, it will not even install the package. So you have to make sure you have those minimum resources or you're dead in the water. And then you can kind of scale back to see what will meet your needs or scale up as they're talking about.
That's right.
So just be very cognizant of that. The RAM works differently, but you need those physical resources just for the install.
All right, well, thanks, Matt. Here's